Welcome to Minerva. I'm Jo, if you've not met me before, and I'm here to do a sewing tutorial today on seam allowances, what they're for, why they're important, and how that will really move up your sewing game. When I first started sewing, I just used to put the two raw edges together and sew it. I didn't even think about the seam allowances. I just thought, I'm joining these two pieces of fabric together and I'm going to try it on and see if it fits. But actually, if you can make accurate seam allowances, then you can make more and more complex garments. Let's have a look at some of the ways that we can be really accurate with our seam allowances. A seam allowance is the distance between your seam line. So this is how big the fabric would be from the right side. And this bit of fabric here is called the seam allowance. And it's often 5/8 of an inch or 1.5. That seems really big. Some people think, well, why am I wasting all of that fabric and having this 1.5 seam allowance? Well, because we're home sewers, we are allowing ourselves a little bit of space for fitting, and we're also making sure that we've got plenty of space here so that our fabric doesn't fray back to the seam line. Seam lines have changed over the decades because now that some of us have an overlocker or a different way to sew our seams, then seams have got a little bit smaller. And seams are smaller in ready-to-wear clothes because if you're cutting out hundreds and hundreds of garments or thousands and thousands of garments, you want to reduce your waste as much as possible. So if this has been sewn on a 4-thread overlocker, so now the seam allowance is really, really small on here, but it can be really small because the overlocker is stopping it fraying. So this one is 4 millimeters. So if we made two items, one with an overlocked edge and one with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance edge, this top or skirt or trousers would be a lot bigger in size than this one. The finished garment measurements will change if we change the seam allowance. It's really important to keep seam allowance consistent throughout your garment because whichever piece we want to fit onto here, so if this was a side seam on the side of a top down there under our arm, then if we want to put a sleeve on then, or a shoulder on, or another a collar on, then we need to make sure that the next piece fits on. So for construction purposes, we really need to make sure that that's consistent. You also need it for sizing, like I just said, and you've also got that little margin for error or for fitting where you can take something out. And let me tell you, a tiny little bit on one seam can make a huge difference on a hip. So if you've got a skirt and you just let that seam out by 5 millimeters, then you've actually added a centimetre to one hip and a centimetre to another hip. And just by using the seam allowance, you can make your skirt 2 centimetres larger around the hip. So that little bit of space there is really useful for alterations. Not all patterns have this 1.5 seam allowance, which is 15 millimeters or 5/8 of an inch. The major pattern companies use that, but if you use an indie pattern, then you might have a different seam allowance. So when you get your pattern, the first thing you need to look for is whether the pattern has A, the seam allowance is included when you cut it out, and B, what the seam allowance is when you sew it. So then you can check your finished garment measurements. You might find as well that you have a different seam allowance on different parts of a garment. So your side seams and most large seams are 1.5, but on collars it tends to be smaller because you don't want all of this bulk inside a collar. So although we're creating this 1.5 seam allowance, quite often we're going to do something with it. We're either going to trim it, finish it, or adapt it in some way. It's really important if you make a toile of a garment or a mock-up of your garment that you use the same seam allowances on your mock-up test piece as you do on your finished piece, because just a tiny bit will make a big difference. So if you make your mock-up and you put it on and you say, oh, it's great, and then you're not so accurate when you sew the next item, then it will really make a difference. And a really good example of that is if you make a bra. So this is one of my bra toiles, and I made it, and because you've got such little margins in each component of the garment, then just tiny little bits will all add up. So this one ended up being a 12 because I didn't keep the seam allowances as accurate as I needed to be on there right in the centre. So I've sort of tucked it to see how much I was out or how much I needed to change for fitting. When you make something really small, that's when you notice the seam allowances make a big difference, because I've only got to add a tiny bit to that seam there and I've completely changed my cup size. The same will happen if you're trying to put in a zip fly, or if you're making jeans and you're making something fitted. Tiny little bits of seam allowances changed in different places will change your finished garment size. Of course, if we've got a 1.5 seam allowance and it's allocated for on our pattern, that's part of the sizing. And this is a vintage pattern piece just because it's got really nice clear instructions on, and vintage patterns always had the seam line shown on it. So it says 1.5 seam allowance, and it's really clearly showing you, you know, when you see that strap you think, oh, that's a nice wide strap, but actually when you see it with the seam allowances added, your strap would be a lot narrower than you think. And seam allowances can be whatever you want them to be. So if a pattern has a 1.5 seam allowance, but you like to use a 1 centimetre seam allowance because you're happy with your fitting and you want to run the edge of your foot along your raw edge because that helps you be a more accurate sewer, that's fine. But you can't do it from this raw edge, because then you're taking 0.5 centimetre off this pattern on every seam, so you will end up with a much bigger garment. That finished garment line there will determine the size of your item. So if you take a smaller seam allowance, you need to make sure that you're taking the smaller seam allowance from the finished garment measurement, and then you can cut that off if you want by 0.5 centimetre all the way round, and then you'll have a 1 centimetre seam allowance. You can't just do 1 centimetre all the way around from the raw edge, because then you're adding 0.5 centimetre all the way around your pattern. It's a bit of a love-hate thing among sewers, but some patterns don't have the seam allowance included at all, so you have to put that on. And some people find that quite an effort, because it means they've got to trace off the pattern, and then they've got to add seam allowances, and then there might be, you've made another sort of layer of mistake sort of possibility. So if you do have to add seam allowances, you can draw them on with a chalk pencil. So if you want to add a 1 centimetre seam allowance to a pattern piece, you've got to go around adding that 1 centimetre on, and then smoothing those lines out. Or I've got a little wheelie tool that's got chalk inside, and it's got a wheel on the side, and that means that I can run the wheel along the edge of the pattern, and it draws the seam line for me. It's great for curves because I can already see how inaccurate I was on that corner there just by doing it with a pencil. So that's added a 1.5 seam allowance, but you can get it to add smaller. So you might want to try a tool that gives you a seam allowance, or you can go round all of your pattern pieces and add the seam allowances, and that's why it's not liked by some sewers. But other people who like to change the seam allowance or make a pattern on their overlocker instead of on their sewing machine can make sure that they get the right fit. If you're new to sewing and you've not been paying so much attention to seam allowances like I used to when I first started, then I'm going to show you a few ways to get a consistent seam allowance. First of all, it's good to check that where you're starting your seam is a 1.5 seam allowance. So don't sort of get started on your sewing and then measure your seam allowance, because actually the critical bit is the start and the end points, because that tends to be where you're going to construct or add another panel or piece of fabric. So first of all, I'm going to use my seam gauge to check that I've definitely got a 1.5 seam allowance at the start of my seam. This seam gauge is great because I can use it as a little tape measure, and I haven't got a big flapping tape measure on my table slipping off the table. And what's also handy is it is 1.5 centimetres in width. So if I wanted to mark, say, a collar to make sure that my collar was going to have the same seam allowance all the way along, I could use that and use the width. Most tape measures are 1.5 centimetres wide, so you can do the same. So you can just keep holding up your tape measure to make sure, or you can use your tape measure to mark on your seam allowance. If I'm making a collar, I actually draw the seam line on so that I know that both points are going to be the same length, and if it's a curved collar, that both my curves are accurate and the same. Another thing I use, not all the time, but quite often, is a magnet seam guide. So it's got a magnet on the back and a bar running along here. And the magnet sits on the foot plate. It's a very strong magnet. I can run the raw edge of my fabric along the edge of the seam guide. That's really good. The only problem you have with that is if you pin vertically. So if you're pinning a curve and you've got some pins holding your work together on a curved edge and you've got your pins sticking out, they hit the seam gauge, so it doesn't work quite so well for that. If you want to still guide yourself with your seam allowance, you can use a tape, a little bit of masking tape or washi tape, and you can stick that to your foot plate so that you can keep a consistent seam allowance. That's really good if you're sewing a collar. Of course, the whole time that I'm showing you all these things, you've got all the measurements on your foot plate. So that's what the grid and the lines are for. So you can make sure that your raw edge is running along one of the grooves on the measurement foot plate. The place that really lets down the accuracy of your seam allowance is when you come off at the end. So while you're sewing, you're being really careful and you're keeping this fabulous seam allowance. And then you get a little bit excited when you get to the end because you're nearly done. And if you dip in or veer out, then you're not quite keeping that seam allowance accurate at the end. And the end is really important because that is where possibly your next piece of construction is going to happen. If I'm just sewing by pinning, then I'll put a little mark at the end that's 1.5, so I can sew quickly, pull pins out quickly, but I can make sure that the beginning and the end is that accurate seam allowance. Another thing that will help your fabric to components and parts to be accurate is to press the seams as you go. So if you've pressed that seam open, you haven't lost a millimetre that's just bulging here. If you press this seam open and you press the next one you're going to attach open, then you'll be really accurate with your joining points here. So make sure you don't just press at the end, but you press each seam as you go. If you want to test how accurate your seam allowances are, then do a little piece of patchwork, and that will really teach you a lot about how accurate you think you are and how accurate you really are. I've got a different foot, so this is a quilter's foot, so it's giving me a smaller seam allowance. I was once making a quilt and my sewing machine went to be serviced, so I used my daughter's machine for a little while, and then when I went to put my pieces together I realised her foot was different to mine, so then my seam allowances were only a millimetre different, but then every cross point on my quilt wouldn't match up. So make sure that if you're quilting or doing some patchwork or doing something really intricate, that you have the same foot in your machine for the entirety of the project. Let's see how accurate we can be and how doing a little bit of patchwork will really teach you a lot about seam allowances. Cut yourself some little squares that are all accurate, because that helps you to get your seam allowance correct, is to have accurate cutting in the first place. And we're going to join these seams and press them open and see how well we can get the cross on each point. So the first thing to check is that you have your raw edges together. They're not a little bit off like this. So I'm going to make sure my raw edges are together. I'm going to use a smaller seam allowance this time. I'm going to use 1 centimetre. And a 1 centimetre seam allowance means I can use the edge of my foot along the raw edge of the fabric. I'm going to go forwards and back at the end. And that's my first one sewn. I'm going to make 3 rows of 3, so I'll have a little 9 patchwork cushion, and I'm going to sew these, and then we're going to have a look at what happens when I try to join them together. Right, we're going to try and join these up and see how accurate we can get these corners. I'll let you into a little secret. I've made 2 deliberate mistakes, and I'm going to show you how that affects the join of 2 seam allowances. So the first thing I'm going to do is to put 2 of the panels right sides together. I have folded 1 seam allowance one way and 1 another, which is really useful on patchwork, because it stops the bulk all being in one direction, and it also sort of locks the seam together, so you can push the one seam against another one and it won't roll over. So I'm going to line up the edges and see what happens to the seams. Here's the seam, and I'm going to show you my deliberate error. So I've matched the edges up, sewn the seam allowance, and it's easier to see on the gingham, but you can see where my black sewing line is starting to run out on there, so that line is actually dipping down. So if I went to add some more patches on this side, then this seam allowance here is a little bit wider. So between that raw edge and that seam allowance is below the red line, but here it's on the red line, so I've got a wider seam allowance here. Let's try the next one. Okay, right sides together. I'm going to pin it with those seam allowances going either way. And I can already feel my next deliberate mistake. So I can see that as I was getting to the end, I was getting a little bit excited and my seam just started to run off. So if I pin that, and I'll just sew it so I can pull it out. I know that that one won't match up because I haven't got the same seam allowances. So you can see that if you were making a bra, how just with that running out a little bit, it doesn't fit. If I correct the mistake, you can see that I was a millimetre over, but don't forget, every inaccuracy you make on a seam allowance is doubled. So that little curve that I had before where it drifted out, that pen line shows where it was, then I would have that much on that side and on the other side. So then all of a sudden I'm 2 to 3 millimetres out on my seam. So it's a really good exercise to do, to sort of really find out how accurate are you and it really does put you in the mindset of thinking, well, gosh, if I want that collar to fit on that top and I want both my collars to be the same, then I need to be really, really accurate with my seam allowances. Here they are finished. So you can see when you're accurate, they meet exactly. Probably a little bit out on that one. Be hard on myself on that one. This one looks good. And this one looks fab. But you can see where the seam inaccuracies change. Yeah, I'm in the red there and I'm drifting out into the white, so I'm getting that pattern distortion. But of course that's all part of accurate cutting as well. I'm not here to give you homework, but what I'm saying is, if you really just have a go at that exercise, and you will really see what happens when you don't use an accurate seam allowance, and then you can sort of gauge yourself on, oh well, that's why that didn't go together, or that's why that was a bit tight, or that's why that collar didn't sit right, especially if you need to stitch in the ditch and you need a waistband facing to come over and exactly fit so that you can stitch in the ditch and catch the fabric on the other side. So even if you've been sewing a long time and you're an intermediate sewer, to get to the next level, seam allowances are absolutely key. I hope that's given you pause for thought, and it's made you think about maybe some of the problems you've been having with your sewing and how you could rectify them. Do head over to Minerva for more tutorials and fitting tips, inspiration, fabric choices, and lots of great things to see from other makers. Do come back again soon for more sewing tutorials.